for the morning. I'm happy that you chose to spend the next 45 minutes with us. Thank you, Alina, for setting up the presentation. Let me get myself set up here. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. This session that we're going to be talking about over the next 45 minutes is an extension of the keynote from this morning. So this morning we focused on understanding more about the social emotional learning competencies and the skills that we want to help our children develop. And in this session, I've tried to find what I think are the best resources that I have used with my own kids, that I have used with educators, and that I have used with students in a classroom. And I've curated them and I'd like to offer them to you. During our time together, we will be using the chat. So feel free if at any point you want to say, hey, that was me, or ask people questions, or I'll be asking you some questions as we go through. Please feel free to utilize that. I'll be monitoring and I can answer back to any of the questions that you have or the comments that you're putting in there. I really thrive on having an opportunity to have interaction back and forth, so that is greatly appreciated. So this morning, one of the bigger ahas and takeaways that I was hoping that you would walk away with is really what is social emotional learning? Because like I mentioned, we shorten it into SEL, and oftentimes it gets people thinking that it's a program or a specific way to do something. And if we break it down, it really is social emotional learning. What are those specific skills that we know will help our children be successful in life, to achieve those greatest hopes and dreams and goals that we talked about during the morning keynote? And oftentimes when people think about social emotional learning, they shrink it down into what you see there in the green as just relationship skills. And what we want to realize is that it is about relationship skills, but it is so much more than that. And how can we work with our kids, no matter what age they are, to get them thinking about these skills, and how can we give them opportunities to practice these skills? There we go. So when I look at each of these 5 competencies, the first 2 that you see in blue and in yellow are called our intrapersonal skills. These are all about who we are as an individual. And they're broken up into 2 parts: self-awareness and self-management. In self-awareness, we're talking about, do we recognize the emotions that we're feeling? And I shared with you the story of Jared, who says he was overheated in school. And he still uses that word overheated to describe being anxious and nervous. But another part of self-awareness is, do we understand who we are, our identities, our social, our cultural, all linguistic identities? And do we know what strengths and skills and gifts, like my friend Lavana Roth says, that we bring to the table, that our students bring to the table? Do we point them out to the students and say, this is what I've noticed, and this is what I love about you? And then the last part of having self-awareness is knowing that we can be successful, having that growth mindset, that success doesn't mean we go from point A to point B and it happens in a second, that we experience some challenges and some setbacks, but with persistence and perseverance, we can achieve those. So moving into self-management is, then can we set and work towards those goals even when we feel that we hit on challenges? And so having a big goal, being able to look back and say, how can we chunk that into small goals and see small pieces of success along the way? And the other part of self-management is that when we're feeling those big emotions, what do we do with it? How do we communicate those emotions and feelings in a way that are constructive and that are respectful to other people? We know that when we focus on who we are and help our children focus on who they are, it allows them and allows us to build stronger, healthier relationships. And that's where social awareness in orange and relationship skills in green come into play. In social awareness, we want our children to be able to identify how other people are feeling and understand other people's points of view. So sometimes when we talk about empathy, our kids might say, oh, but that didn't happen to me, so I can't understand. And it's being able to help our children realize that even though you didn't have a similar situation, maybe you can understand the emotion that that person is experiencing and how they respond in a way that is kind and respectful and connects them to that person. When we talk then about social awareness, it's also understanding that sometimes how other people feel and the actions that they take are not necessarily a result of who they are, but of the system around them, the environment around them. So the story I shared with you was of my niece, Allie, who all of a sudden in kindergarten stopped speaking Spanish at home. It's not because she didn't know Spanish. It's not because she didn't like speaking Spanish, but something had happened at school that was encouraging her to not want to share that part of her identity. In relationship skills, we talked about how important it is to know how to build healthy relationships, how to be an effective communicator, how to be a good listener, how to work together as a team, how to cooperate and collaborate with people. But it's also about how do we maintain those relationships when conflict arises, when stress arises, when our students are experiencing peer pressure or seeing something that is unfair or unjust. We know that when we help our children grow in those 4 competencies, it allows them to be able to make better, more responsible, more caring decisions. We want them to be curious and to stay curious about themselves and about other people. We want them to be able to look at all the information around them and to make reasoned judgments so that they can be good problem solvers and so that they can make decisions that are healthy and safe for them and for those around them. So I gave you examples in the keynote of some of the experiences my own kids had. And right now, I'd like to show you some of those ways that I've worked with my kids and other people's kids on how we can develop those skills. One of the first things that pops up, and somebody did mention this in the keynote, and so I was really thankful for that, is that when our kids feel big emotions, they don't always know how to articulate it. They don't always know what words to use. And in fact, there are studies that show if I asked you to write down all the emotions that you can think of, adults can usually only come up with 12 to 15. Look at this wheel though. Look at how many words are on here, and they describe all the different emotions that we as humans can experience. Now, I don't have this on the slide, so I'm going to type it in here. This is a modification or a version of what's called Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions. And he did research and found that there are 6 fundamental emotions that we all start off with. So if you have kids who are in pre-K to 2nd grade, they will all pretty much tell you when they feel happy, sad, angry, surprised. But as our kids get older, their emotions become more complex. And instead of using the word happy, they could say, I was overjoyed, I was excited, I was content. And all of those words are a version of the word happy, but they're deeper, they're more meaningful. Wendy, I love this. Yes, and there's an overload of emotions. And do you see how the shades change? That you can have multiple emotions at once. And how do we help our children be able to pick the word that aligns with how they're feeling? And so I started using this wheel of emotions with my kids and in schools because we would say, how do you physically feel in your body? And the kids, Jared said pins and needles in my arms and legs, and my stomach was rolling over. Maybe they have a headache. And then we say, well, what happened right before this? So what was the trigger that led to that emotion? And now let's try to put a word with that emotion. So Another way that I've seen teachers use this is if you go to Walmart or to a paint store or to like an AC Moore, have you ever seen the paint strips where if you get a yellow, it's different shades of yellow and some start off light and they get darker? You could put in the lighter shade the word love and then ask your children what other words can be used for love and how are they similar and how are they different than love? So I've walked into classrooms before where teachers had all of these different paint strip colors and they were practicing with kids to know all the other different types of words that they can use to describe their emotions. So for me, I found this to be one of the most valuable tools to help with helping our children be able to learn new words to associate with their emotions. And I'll tell you a tip, I use it for myself too. Because I am one of those people where I get really strong emotions and then I have to think through how am I actually feeling and why did this happen? And so looking at these words helps me get better at explaining to other people how I feel. So the second one that I would like to show you relates back to identity. And this is actually a newer version that I found. And if you look at the bottom of the slide on the right-hand side, I did try to give you the URL. So if you wanted to go back and find the similar activity, you could do that. But you can also just draw this activity out on a sheet of paper. And so at the center, you'll want to put your child's name. And then you draw arrows out and you ask them, how do you describe yourself? How do you view who you are? And if you look in purple, I went and I did the activity for myself. So at the top, I see myself as a mom, first and foremost. But I also see myself as female. I live in a house full of boys. And so there's a distinct difference there for me. And then I see myself as Mexican and German. I see myself as a traveler. I like to go to new places if I can. I see myself as an educator, but I'm also a sister and a daughter, and I'm a learner. And I'm middle class. I know this because I'm sometimes pulling to figure out how I'm going to get my bills paid. So I know I'm not in the wealthy class. But every month I'm reminded of that because I pay my bills. And so I wish I would have known about this when my kids were younger, because I would have drawn this for them and said, tell me the words that describe you. And then the next year I would have said, let's sit down and tell me the words that describe you. I would have loved to have put this together as a book over all of the years so that when my kids graduated high school, I could give them with their version of who they felt they were all through the years and look to see how that may have changed. Now, you might notice that there are blue words written on here as well. This is a more advanced version of this identity chart. And what we can ask our children to do is, how do you think other people see you? And so somebody in the last session said that their child often will say, oh, so-and-so doesn't like me, but the evidence doesn't show that. And so sometimes this can help our kids when they're having that worry brain, like, oh, this person doesn't like me, or I'm not good at this, that let's talk about your perception of how people view you versus who you really are. And in this particular case, I reached out to my mom, my sister, and my husband, and I said, and my boys actually, how would you describe me? And so what is there in blue is how I know they see me. And the thing that I think really resonates is that I trust them. And so I know that they're going to tell me the truth. And so even though I might not see myself as some of these pieces, to know that they see me as being loyal, as a philanthropist. I'm the one who put in workaholic, but as empathetic helps me be able to merge how I see myself and how other people see me. Along the same lines of identity, there is a man named Dr. Lewis Moll who did research around what he calls funds of knowledge. And so this was helping different cultures, whether it's religious, linguistic, language, racial, economic, to have an opportunity to look at the skill sets and the strengths that they have in their families. And so this is a worksheet that I often share with teachers. And I say, give this to your kids and let them take it home and fill it out as a family. So the link at the bottom right-hand corner here is actually a link that will take you to the worksheet that you can download and you can type into it. And this helps our families, helps you have a conversation with your children about the things that make you unique, your strengths as a family. And so it'll ask, what's the home language? What languages do you speak? And even within my own family, we've got English, Spanish, and Italian. And that's something that if a teacher knew that that was our strengths, that they could infuse into the classroom. What are the family values and traditions? What's important? What holidays do you celebrate? Where do you celebrate? What do you celebrate? The next one is around caregiving. How do you take care of each other? Where do you go when you have some time off? Do you like to take walks in the woods? Do you like to have a picnic? Do you like to get in a car and drive to the neighboring town and walk around there? What are the chores that you take part in? Because these are all skills that our students can leverage and notice the strengths for their future. So my husband right now, oftentimes, and we'll talk about this later, with what is success, he didn't go to college. What was important for him is that he was a builder. He worked as a contractor with a contractor when he was younger, and he now works as a sheet metal worker. And so he helps build and design and install huge ventilation systems into children's hospitals. And so he, even though he doesn't have the memorization and the book learning, he has a hands-on, highly skilled job that not everybody can do. And that is something that with his math background and with his hands-on type of experience is an asset to our family. And so this worksheet gives you an opportunity to talk to your kids about your family strengths and how they can use those to be successful in other areas of their life. The last one that I want to share with you goes back to that idea of how do we set goals and work towards them. And this is one that I found online and I typed it up, and it doesn't necessarily need to look like this, but every week I would sit down with my kids when they were younger and I'd say, what's your goal for the week? And it might be an academic goal. It could be, I want to read 2 chapters in this book. It could be something about a social goal, like I'd like to reach out and say hi to 2 new people this week. Or it could be something around, I want to learn how to ride my bike from point A to point B without the training wheels. Or I want to get better at this type of soccer dribble. And so letting the kids pick what goal is important to them. And then at the end of the week, this is a reflection sheet. What worked well for you? What were some of the challenges that you experienced in trying to achieve that goal or work towards your goal? And then what would you like to do next week to continue working towards that goal? Or if you did accomplish it, what is your next goal? So some things, and I put this in here because goal setting is not always a strength of mine. I'm like, oh, this is where I want to be. And I feel like time gets in my way. And when I sit down and I plan things like this and I chunk it into small little pieces, it helps me feel more successful. And this is what we want for our children. Sometimes they look at people who have success and think it happened overnight or that that person didn't experience any challenges. And this activity gives them an opportunity to think about what might happen, how do I use my time, what worked for me, what didn't work for me, and how can I do that differently in the future? So I'd like you to think about, when we're talking about self-awareness, which of these 4 activities resonated with you the most and that you would like to try with your children? So feel free to type A, B, C, or D into the chat. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear it as well. So thank you, Alina. I see that you put in B. That is one of my new favorite activities. I think that, and I'm going to send this to my sister-in-law because I think that helping our kids understand their uniquenesses and the gifts that they bring to their friend group, to school, to work is really powerful for them. Good. I'm seeing some C's. I'm seeing some D's in there. Oh, another A. That's also one of my favorites. Feel free again if you have any questions or you want to just talk about how you may have used this in the past or any other ideas that you have, feel free to put that in the chat as well. Thank you so much for being able to interact with me. It helps me out as well. So let's go on and take a look at managing those emotions, because I feel like with our kids, especially during COVID, friends, this has been a rough 2 years for us and for our kids. So much social interaction has been taken away from them that I often hear that we're seeing kids who are ninth graders who might still be in the social emotional behaviors and feelings of a seventh grader, or seventh graders who are still kind of responding and acting the way that we would traditionally see a fifth grader. This is normal because of what we've experienced. And so, even more now than ever, we need to have those conversations with our children on how we can help them to become more skilled at some of these pieces. And so, what you see here on the left is another strategy for managing big emotions. I mentioned to you earlier that Jared would put his head down on his desk and breathe in really deep. That's what works for him. The other piece I didn't share with you this morning is that when Jared got into fifth grade, he all of a sudden started having social anxiety related to school. He would cry and hated to leave the house and have a meltdown about not wanting to go to school. I called the school. There was nothing happening with friends. People were treating him well. It wasn't something with the teacher. It was just this anxiety switch that went on with him. And he would say he was overheated, the same thing that he said when he was in second grade. It happened again in eighth grade. And so he was having these big emotions that he didn't know how to deal with. And for a mom, I was like, stay home, I'll take care of you. But what I realized is that that wasn't healthy for him either. I had to help acclimate him back to school again. And so when we have our kids having those big emotions, like Jared does, like Ethan did when he was little, what can we do to help them learn how to manage those? And I worked with a teacher in New Jersey a couple weeks ago, and the teacher said, but in the middle of a meltdown, how do we teach this to our kids? The middle of a meltdown is not the good time to do this. We need to have these conversations with our children. I was going to say kids and children at the same time, with our children when they're feeling good, and talk to them about the different options that they have available to them. So on the left, you see this quiet seat here. And this is my niece, Sydney, who's in second grade. This is her quiet corner. And so Sydney also used to have big emotions, because kids do. But the way that she used to handle them was to go hide under the kitchen table and cry. And so what my sister worked on with her, and that when I'm there, I help her with too, is she's having a meltdown. She knows that she can go up to her quiet corner. She sits on the chair, closes the drapes around her, and will snuggle one of her animals or read a book. When she calms down through breathing strategies, she comes back out of her room and we have a conversation about what happened. But in the middle of her having a meltdown, it was hard. And so there's a chart here that talks about steps to managing big emotions. And it talks about how do we validate that within our children, and how do we help calm them down. And so it'll say, for instance, reminding myself that it is not okay to hurt others, that even though we're having big emotions, we need to keep ourselves and others safe. Learning how to take 3 deep breaths to get the oxygen going through our brains and our body, and to give us a chance to calm. To think about picking words to express how we're feeling, and that's hard in the moment. So I thought that perhaps looking at different ways that we can talk to our kids when they're calm could help us when they're feeling those big emotions. Now, this part is more for you, my friends, but it's understanding that the changes are not going to happen immediately or overnight. When our kids feel big emotions, their brains click right from feeling to doing something and to expressing that. It takes time and consistency and patience to teach them new ways of responding when they have a big emotion. But this is here to assure you, to reassure you that it can change. Because when our students learn new ways of responding to their emotions, it starts to change their ways that their brain functions and the ways that their brain is wired. And they do learn over time how to regulate that. So please, if you're experiencing this now, like I did back then, don't give up. With time and patience and perseverance and consistency, we can start working to help our children's minds shift. Now, the last one I wanted to show you related to self-management has to do with goal setting again, because this is a big one. But there's an acronym called WHOOP, and this is from the University of Pennsylvania. And it's a way of helping our children set and achieve goals as well. The W stands for wish. What do you wish to be able to do? And the outcome is, how do you think you'll feel when you experience success of accomplishing that goal? The second O, I think, is really critical here, and that is the obstacle piece, because this lets our kids know that you will always hit a bump in the road. Something, there'll be a little glitch. It might be big, it might be small, but we need to prepare ourselves and think ahead at what that might be. And then lastly, it's plan. What are we going to do step by step to plan towards achieving that goal? And what if that bump in the road does come up? How are we going to respond to that? Now, I like this for goal setting because I know that when my kids were younger, they'd be like, I wanted to be able to do this. And they get frustrated when it didn't happen right away. So this just gives them an opportunity to break down step by step by step how to achieve a big goal, and looking at the small successes that they can celebrate that lead them to the big goal. And if they hit that bump in the road, they can reflect on what happened and how they could address it differently next time. So looking at these 3 activities, what is one that you would like to try with your child and why? Or if you have something else that you'd like to share that you do, please feel free to put it in the chat. While you're working on putting that in, I'll keep moving forward, but know you can ask questions about any of these pieces as we move forward. Our next category, oh, there we go. I like the whoop. Here comes the text messaging. I like the whoop. It seems like that's a very popular one, and it's also one that our kids like saying. And as we keep moving forward with it, they become more comfortable with it, and they start to be able to make those connections on their own. So thank you for the opportunity to put that in there. The next piece that we'll be taking a look at is a really big piece right now that we've been working on because of COVID, and that is, how do we develop empathy? And empathy is a really complex skill. It's not something that happens right away. And so we have to understand that for our students, it takes time to be able to read the emotions and the body language of somebody else. And for the last 2 years, we've had a mask over our face, and it makes it difficult to be able to really understand what people might be thinking through their facial expressions and their body language. So one of the resources that I found offered lots of different ways that you could work with your children on how to develop empathy and try to understand somebody else's perspective just through nonverbal cues. So what you see here are pictures of characters in different poses. And so what you could do is take one of these poses and ask your child, what emotion do you think you are seeing in this character and why? So for instance, oftentimes if you see somebody who's standing with their arms folded, your first thought might be that they're angry. but it could also be that they're cold and trying to keep themselves warm. And so helping our students understand that body language could mean different things, but it's practicing that helps us get better. Another thing that I used to work on with students when I work in the classrooms for this is I'll tell the students, let me see what it looks like when you're sad. What does it look like when you're happy, when you're excited? And when the students make that pose, I have them turn to a partner and see how their partner expresses that emotion. They talk about what is similar in the way that they're posing or what might be unique and different. We break down these emotions so that they understand what this might feel like for them, but then what this might look like when they see it in somebody else. Another way that you can do this is through picture books or through television and cartoons. As you're reading through the book, point out to a character and ask your child, what do you think this character is feeling? And what led you to that? What is it about the way that they're standing or their face that leads you to think that? Same thing on television. Pause it and intersperse those conversations with your children. For the older students or for you, there is a really great, very short video from Dr. Brene Brown. And because empathy is a very complex skill, we really have to talk to our children about what it means to be empathetic. And even teachers I've worked with would say, I don't know how to be empathetic because I didn't experience that event. And that's a misconception because what we want to understand is that you and I don't have to have experienced the same thing for us to be empathetic. If I can understand the emotion that you're feeling, then I can be empathetic because you and I are connected because we know what it's like to feel sad. We know what it's like to feel overwhelmed. We know what it's like to feel distraught. And in this particular cartoon, the fox is having a bad day. And you know, when you have a bad day, you're like, the world is closing in on me. I just want to crawl into my bed. And the video here shows the fox going down into the ground, into their cave. And a lot of time in society, we talk about, we talk about sympathy. Well, they showed the bear looking down into the cave going, oh, I see you're down having a bad day. That's terrible. I feel sympathetic for you. I feel sympathy. Sympathy is when you feel for somebody, but you're far away. And then it shows the bear climbing down the ladder into the cave and saying, I'm going to be with you in your sadness, in your bad day. That is empathy. My older son, Ethan, who I said was 20, when he was in high school, he used to work as a counselor at an overnight camp. And the kids stayed with them for 5 days and they ate all their meals together. One day, Ethan called me and said one of the young men in his group had found out the night before that his dad went to jail. And the boy was distraught. And Ethan said, I didn't know what to do. And I said, so tell me what you did do. And he said, the boy quite obviously didn't want to be around people and eating. He needed some time to himself. So Ethan said he walked with him down to where the stream went and there was a duck. And he's like, I didn't know what to say to him. So I didn't say anything at all. I just sat with him and we watched the water go by. And that filled my heart because that right there is empathy. Ethan didn't have that experience, but he knew what heartbreak felt like. He knew what loss felt like. And he didn't let that young man be alone. So how can we take advantage of time to have these conversations with our kids and to understand that we experience different events, but we can have those same emotions with one another? So when you think about this piece, where do you think your kids are? What do you think might be most interesting to them, or what skill do they need? How to identify the emotions that other people are feeling, or how to respond to those emotions and be with someone during their hard times. Thank you, Maria, for putting that in there. That empathy piece It's so critical and it's such a good skill to have. Um, and it's something that we work on all the time as adults as well. Yeah. How to respond to those emotions that we're seeing in other people. I think one of the worst things in the world, the worst punishment we can give a human is isolation. And that's what they do in jails, right? You get in trouble, you're in isolation. We are not meant to be isolated from each other. And that connection is what we thrive on. And when we can see when somebody else is feeling an uncomfortable emotion, one of the highest forms of humanity is to sit with that person, to be with that person, and let them know that they're not alone. And that leads us into the building relationships piece. And that is not one of the easier skills as well. I know when the kids are younger, sometimes they kind of gravitate really towards each other right away and they're playing on the playground and that's how they make friends. But it gets a little bit more complex as we get older. And I mentioned to you earlier that Jared has some anxiety, and I think he gets that from me. So even though I love to work with groups about social emotional learning, I actually have anxiety as well. And I get very nervous speaking to people that I don't know. And it's hard to build relationships because I'm always afraid of interrupting what somebody else is doing by starting a conversation. What I've learned over time is that our kids need those same supports that I need. And so, how can we help them if they're shy or if they're nervous, know how to build strong connections with other people? And so, what I thought might be helpful for you is this slide on meaningful discussion stems. So, starting off in the top left, you could work with your children on one or two questions that they could keep in their back pocket to open up a conversation with somebody. So they could say, "Oh, I noticed your hat. It's really lovely. Tell me where you got that." Or, "So I have a question that I was hoping you could answer for me." Or, "I wonder how they made this pizza that they're serving in the cafeteria." Um, or if they hear somebody else talking, they could say, "Oh, wow, that was a really great idea. What do you think if?" Or, "I agree with that. And I'd like to add a thought to this." Or, "Wow, I never thought of it that way. What if we did this instead?" Helping our children have those tools in their toolbox can help them learn how to open up and build those relationships. I think it's also important when we're talking about working collaboratively in groups or as a team. How can we help build relationships by ensuring that everybody is involved? So some of these questions could be used for, "Well, I noticed Sarah hasn't spoken yet. Sarah, what do you think about that?" Or, "What's your opinion?" And so here is just another scaffold that we can use with our students on how to build those healthy relationships with other people. It's the maintaining relationships too that can be really hard. And so I liked this resource because it helps our students do two things. One, it can help them understand what is a healthy relationship and what is an unhealthy relationship. And so, how can we sit down with our children and talk to them about what does it look like and sound like and feel like to build that healthy relationship, and what does an unhealthy relationship look like? And how do we work when we're having a conflict where our boundaries are not being respected? And so here you can see it says an unhealthy way to respond to conflict and then a healthy way to respond to conflict. And I think it's important to note here that conflict is not a bad thing. Conflict is what moves us in a new direction. Conflict is a signal that we have an opportunity to learn. And so conflict just means that there's a difference in viewpoint, a difference in perspective. And how can we work with our children to understand what is good for them and what is a boundary where they can say, "You know what, this is not healthy conflict for me. And this is what I need in order to keep myself safe emotionally and physically." So, thinking about what you can work on with your children, Do you think that the ways of being able to build relationships might be more beneficial? Or do you think at this point, talking to your kids about healthy and unhealthy relationships or how to respond to that conflict when the relationship may not be healthy would be more beneficial? Feel free to type into the chat. Building the relationships. Yep. And Courtney, one of the things that we talked about in the earlier session, I remember in third grade moving from one school to the next in the middle of the school year. And I still think it was one of the most traumatizing events of my life. And I think maybe that's where some of my anxiety came from, is that walking into a new class of 30 students and not knowing anybody, and they had already established their friendships. And so I do think that where do we start and how can we open up those conversations and start building those relationships is really key and very critical. Yeah, and Betsy, I think too that especially when they've been in those friendships for so long, that is when we start to see the conflict come up. Especially too, is it's their lives become more complex. And so their problems become bigger because of what they're dealing with. And that is actually what's going to lead us into our last section here. Is that when we're looking at the problems, looking at the conflicts, how do we help our children understand what is a tiny size 1 problem and what is a huge size 5 problem? Because I know that when my kids were little, every time they started arguing or getting into a conflict, I'm like, oh, I don't have time for this. And I would jump in and solve it for them. But as they got older, I realized that they needed to figure that out for themselves. And so if they would come to me and say, Mom, Ethan's doing this, Mom, Jared's doing that, I needed to stop myself and say, I need you two to figure it out. Because then that helps them learn to be able to navigate and negotiate. And Tammy, I'm so glad that you said that that continuum is helpful, because this was a huge aha for me. Because we also need to let our students and our children know when they should be going for help, if they're in danger, if somebody else is in danger. And here, I like that it says, here are the problems that define huge. Here are the big problems. Go find a trusted adult. That this is something that it's better to have other people involved than you trying to figure it out by yourself. I really liked this piece. Oh yeah, you do the same thing with your kids? Yes. So Evelyn, it reminded me too of I shared a room with my sister for all of my years, and my parents let us figure it out. When my sister and I were fighting, we would get a piece of tape and tape off the room in half. But because I was older, I knew enough to get the side where the door was. So she always got the side of the room where she'd have to jump from her side out the door because she couldn't be in my side. So even though that sounds ridiculous, it was something though that, one, not only gave us good memories, but two, helped us learn how to navigate things, because eventually we came back together and we solved our problem and the tape came up. But as our kids get older, they realize that when they experience conflict, when there's a problem, there are so many different ways that they can navigate that. Now, how many of you in the chat, if you can put, have you ever said to your kids, I can't believe you did that. What were you thinking? Have you ever asked your kids, what were you thinking? Thank you. Yep. And as soon as I say that, I'm like, oh my gosh, I sound like my mom. And Evelyn, it looks like you and your sister did the room with the blanket. Yep. And so our children are not thinking. The way that our brains work is that up here is the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of our brains that look for decision making, that are looking at what are the consequences of what we're doing. That doesn't develop until they're 24 or 25. So this helps them say, here's my problem, here's my conflict. What are all the different ways that I could respond, and what would happen if I responded that way? And then looking at what their options are and picking one is a good way for them to think about what's coming up. So I just gave a whole lot of information for you, different strategies. But the most essential piece here is that we are in it together. We are working with our kids at home. We know that your teachers in Orange County are working on these same skills. And that's great because our kids are getting the same context. We know that it takes time to develop these skills. And when we can have those explicit conversations and share our experiences with our kids, it allows them to know they're in a safe environment where they can practice and get better at these skills. Because eventually they're going to be independent, and would hope that we've given them enough opportunities to practice that they do have that successful, happy, productive life that we've wanted for them. So thank you so much for your time, your attention, and I love that you were willing to interact with me. Have a great rest of your day and take care. Yep.
Thank you so much, Krista, for your wonderful presentation. I've dropped a poll in here. I'm also going to drop in another one. This one is for the session. And then we're also going to drop one in that is for the entire event. So please take a moment to complete both surveys for us. And then I'm also going to drop in a link to our OCPS Families YouTube channel. Recording of this session will be available very soon. So I'm going to add that here as well. And then, Krista, if you want to go ahead and advance to the last slide, there's 2 more events that are coming up here in Orange County that we'd like for you to save on your calendars. And please follow us on Facebook so that you can have all of this wonderful information about ways to help our students. Thank you all for being here.